Margaret Chen woke up every morning at 6:30. She had been doing this for 40 years. Even now, at 78 years old, her body still knew when to wake up. The sun came through her bedroom window and made patterns on the wall. She liked watching these patterns change as the seasons changed. Her house was small but clean. She had lived here with her husband Robert for 35 years before he died. That was 5 years ago now. The house still smelled like his coffee and her flowers. Margaret kept everything the way it was when Robert was alive. His reading glasses were still on the kitchen table. His favorite coffee mug was still in the same spot in the cupboard. Margaret got out of bed slowly. Her knees hurt more now than they used to. Her back was stiff in the mornings, but she did not complain. She was grateful to wake up each day. Many of her friends were already gone. She missed them, but she was not ready to join them yet. In the kitchen, Margaret made her breakfast. 1 piece of toast with butter and jam, 1 cup of tea with milk and sugar. She ate at the small table by the window. From here she could see her garden. The roses were blooming red and pink. The tomatoes were getting bigger each day. The garden made her happy. It was something she could still do well. After breakfast, Margaret walked outside to check her plants. She wore Robert's old gardening gloves. They were too big for her hands, but she liked wearing them. It made her feel close to him. She watered the flowers and picked the ripe tomatoes. The neighbors often stopped to talk when they saw her outside. Mrs. Johnson from next door came over with her small dog. "Good morning, Margaret," she said. "Your roses look beautiful this year." Margaret smiled. "Thank you. Robert planted them for me years ago. They still grow strong." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "He was a good man. You take good care of his garden." After Mrs. Johnson left, Margaret went back inside. She had many things to do. She liked to keep busy. First, she made her bed. Then she cleaned the dishes from breakfast. She swept the kitchen floor and wiped the counters. The house was not big, so cleaning did not take long. At 10 o'clock, Margaret sat in her favorite chair to read. She had many books. Robert used to read to her in the evenings. Now she read to herself. Sometimes the words were hard to see. Sometimes she forgot what happened in the story. But she kept reading because it made her feel normal. The phone rang at 11:30. It was her son David. He called every few days to check on her. "Hi, Mom," David said. "How are you feeling today?" "I am fine, dear," Margaret said. "I picked tomatoes this morning. The garden is doing well." "That's good, Mom. Sarah and I will come visit this weekend. We can help you with anything you need." Margaret was happy to hear this. She loved seeing David and his wife, Sarah. "I will cook dinner for you," she said. "You don't have to cook, Mom. We can bring food." "I like to cook for my family, Margaret. So it makes me happy." David was quiet for a moment. "Okay, Mom. We'll see you Saturday around noon." After the phone call, Margaret felt excited. She had not seen David and Sarah for 2 weeks. She started planning what to cook, maybe pot roast with vegetables. That was David's favorite when he was little. Margaret walked to the kitchen and looked. In the refrigerator, she had enough food for a small meal but not enough for a special dinner. She would need to go to the store. The grocery store was 6 blocks away. Margaret still walked there twice a week. Her legs were not as strong as before, but she could still make the trip. She put on her walking shoes and took her purse. The walk to the store took her 20 minutes now. It used to take 10 minutes when she was younger, but she was not in a hurry. She liked walking through the neighborhood. She had lived here for so long that she knew every house and every tree. At the grocery store, Margaret took a small cart. She walked slowly through the aisles. The meat counter had good beef for pot roast. The vegetables looked fresh. She picked carrots, potatoes, and onions. She also got milk and bread. The total cost was $32. Margaret counted her money carefully. She had enough, but she had to be careful. Her pension was not very big. The young man at the checkout was kind. "Do you need help carrying these bags, Mrs. Chen?" he asked. "No, thank you," Margaret said. "I can manage." The walk home was harder with the heavy bags. Margaret had to stop twice to rest. Her arms got tired and her breathing was heavy. but she made it home safely. She put the groceries away and sat down to rest. In the afternoon, Margaret cleaned the house extra well for David's visit. She dusted the furniture and vacuumed the rugs. She washed the windows so they would be bright and clean. The work was harder now than it used to be. She had to rest more often. Sometimes she forgot which room she had already cleaned. At 3:00, Margaret's neighbor, Mr. Williams, knocked on her door. He was 85 years old and lived alone, too. Sometimes they helped each other. "Margaret, I'm going to the pharmacy," he said. "Do you need anything?" "No, thank you, Jim," she said. "I picked up my medicine last week." Margaret took 5 different pills every day. One for her heart, one for her blood pressure, one for her bones, and 2 vitamins. David had written the names of all her pills on a piece of paper. He helped her organize them in a pill box with sections for each day of the week. In the evening, Margaret cooked a simple dinner: chicken soup with crackers. She ate while watching the news on television. The news was often sad, but she liked to know what was happening in the world. After dinner, she washed her dishes and sat in Robert's chair. This was her favorite time of day. The house was quiet and peaceful. Margaret looked at the pictures on the side table. There was her wedding picture with Robert. There was David as a baby. There was David's graduation from college. There was David and Sarah's wedding picture. These pictures made her happy and sad at the same time. Happy for the good memories. Sad because time had gone by so fast. At 9:00, Margaret got ready for bed. She took her evening pills and brushed her teeth. She put on her nightgown and said her prayers. She thanked God for another good day. She asked him to keep David and Sarah safe. She asked him to help her stay healthy, so she would not be a burden to anyone. Margaret did not know that her peaceful life was about to change. She did not know that David was growing tired of worrying about her. She did not know that some people saw her as a problem instead of a person. She went to sleep that night feeling grateful and content, just as she had every night for the past 5 years. David Chen sat in his car outside his mother's house. He had been there for 10 minutes but had not gotten out yet. Every week the visits felt harder. Every week there was something new wrong with the house or with his mother. He loved her, but he was getting tired. Sarah sat next to him in the passenger seat. She could see the stress on her husband's face. "Are you okay?" she asked. David sighed. "I'm fine. Let's just get this over with." They walked to the front door. David used his key to open it. "Mom, we're here," he called out. Margaret came from the kitchen. She was wearing an old dress with stains on it. Her hair was not combed well. "David, Sarah, I'm so happy to see you." She hugged them both. David noticed that she smelled like she had not bathed in a few days. The house smelled different too. Not bad, just old and stuffy. "How have you been, Mom?" Sarah asked with a smile. "Oh, I've been fine," Margaret said. Come, I made lunch for you." They followed her to the kitchen. On the table were 3 plates with sandwiches. The bread looked old and the lettuce was brown. Sarah and David looked at each other. "Mom, when did you make these?" David asked. Margaret looked confused. "This morning, or maybe yesterday. I don't remember." David felt worried and frustrated at the same time. Last week his mother had left the stove on all night. The week before she had forgotten to pay her electric bill, and the power was almost turned off. They sat down to eat. Sarah took small bites and smiled. David pushed the food around on his plate. Margaret ate happily and talked about her garden and her neighbors. "Mrs. Johnson's dog got out again," Margaret said. "I helped her look for it. We found it 3 blocks away." "Mom, you shouldn't be walking that far," David said. "What if you got lost?" "I won't get lost," Margaret said. "I know this neighborhood better than anyone." But David knew that wasn't true anymore. Last month, Margaret had called him crying because she couldn't find her way home from the grocery store. A kind stranger had to help her. After lunch, David looked around the house. The refrigerator had old food in it. Some of it was moldy. The bathroom was not very clean. Bills were piled up on the kitchen counter, some of them unopened. "Mom, you need to throw away this old food," David said, opening the refrigerator. What old food? Margaret asked. She looked in the refrigerator. That cheese is still good. The cheese was green with mold. David threw it in the trash. Margaret looked upset. You're wasting good food, she said. Mom, that cheese could make you sick, David said, his voice getting louder. Sarah touched David's arm. Let me help you clean up, Margaret, she said gently. While Sarah helped in the kitchen, David looked at the bills. The phone bill was 2 months late. The water bill had a warning notice. His mother's checking account was getting low. David felt anger growing inside him. He worked hard at his job. He had his own family to take care of. His daughter Emma was starting college next year and needed money for tuition. His younger daughter Lucy was in high school and did expensive activities. Now he had to worry about his mother's bills too. Mom, you forgot to pay these bills again, David said, showing her the papers. Margaret looked at the bills like she had never seen them before. I thought I paid those, she said. You say that every week, David said. I can't keep coming here to fix everything. David, Sarah said quietly. She gave him a warning look. But David was too frustrated to stop. Mom, you can't live alone anymore. Look at this place, look at yourself, you're not taking care of anything. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm doing my best, she said. Your best isn't good enough anymore, David said. Maybe it's time to think about a nursing home. The words hung in the air like a bomb. Margaret stared at her son. Sarah looked shocked. David, Sarah said. What? Someone has to say it, David said. She can't take care of herself. I can't keep coming here every week to clean up her messes. I have my own life. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. She looked very small and old. I don't want to go to a nursing home, she said quietly. Mom, I know you don't want to, David said, his voice softer now. But you need help. More help than I can give. Sarah knelt down next to Margaret's chair. No one is making any decisions today, she said, looking at David. We're just talking. After they left, David drove home in silence. Sarah stared out the window. Finally, she spoke. That was cruel, she said. It was honest, David replied. You saw how she's living. The spoiled food, the unpaid bills, the dirty house. What if she falls and no one finds her for days? So we help her more, Sarah said. With what time? With what money? David asked. Emma needs money for college. Lucy needs new equipment for soccer. The mortgage payment went up. My boss is talking about layoffs. When do I have time to be my mother's caretaker? Sarah understood David's stress. Money was tight in their house too. But something about the way he talked about his mother bothered her. She raised you, Sarah said. She took care of you when you couldn't take care of yourself. That was different, David said. I was a child. She chose to have a child. I didn't choose to have an aging mother. But you have one anyway, Sarah said. Over the next few weeks, David's visits to his mother became shorter. He would stop by, check that she was alive, fix 1 or 2 urgent problems, and leave. He stopped staying for meals. He stopped sitting and talking with her. Margaret noticed the change. She started calling David more often. The calls made David angry. Sometimes she called 3 times in one day asking the same questions. Mom, you already called me this morning, David would say. I did? I don't remember, Margaret would say. These conversations made David feel guilty and frustrated. He started letting the calls go to voicemail. Sometimes he didn't call back for 2 days. Sarah watched her husband change. He used to talk about his childhood with his mother. He used to laugh about the funny things she did. Now he only complained about her. Every conversation about Margaret was about problems, money, or time. Maybe we could have her over for dinner once a week, Sarah suggested one evening. Are you crazy? David said. She can barely take care of herself. What if she burns our house down? What if she forgets where she is and wanders outside at night? Sarah had not thought about these possibilities. Maybe David was right to be worried. But when Sarah visited Margaret alone one afternoon, she saw something different. Yes, Margaret was forgetful. Yes, the house was not as clean as it used to be, but Margaret was still kind. She was still funny. She still had good days when her mind was clear. "How is David?" Margaret asked during the visit. "He's been stressed about work," Sarah said. Margaret nodded. "I worry about him. He works too hard, just like his father did." Sarah realized that Margaret still cared about David, even though he was pulling away from her, even though he was talking about putting her in a nursing home. That night, Sarah tried to talk to David about his mother again. "She's not as bad as you think," Sarah said. "She still has good moments." "Good moments don't pay bills," David said. "Good moments don't prevent accidents. Good moments don't solve the problem." "Maybe the problem isn't her," Sarah said carefully. "Maybe the problem is how we're thinking about this." David looked at his wife like she was crazy. "The problem is that my mother is becoming a burden I can't handle, and it's only going to get worse." Sarah felt a chill when David called his mother a burden. She wondered when he had started thinking about Margaret as a problem instead of a person. She wondered what would happen when David decided he was tired of dealing with the problem. Margaret, alone in her house that night, also felt the change in her son. She saw how he looked at her now, like she was something broken that needed to be fixed or thrown away. She tried to be less trouble for him. She tried to clean better and remember more. But forgetting was not something she could control. As autumn approached, the gap between David and his mother grew wider. Margaret felt more alone than she had since Robert died. David felt more trapped than he had ever felt in his life. And Sarah was caught in the middle, watching her family slowly break apart. Margaret woke up on a Tuesday morning in October feeling happy. The leaves outside her window were turning red and gold. She loved autumn. It reminded her of when David was little, and they would rake leaves together in the yard. She made her breakfast and sat by the window to eat. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. It was David. "Hi, Mom," he said. His voice sounded different, friendlier than it had been in weeks. "Good morning, dear," Margaret said. "How are you?" "I'm good, Mom. Listen, I have an idea. The leaves are really beautiful this year. Would you like to go for a drive to see them? We could go up to the state forest. Remember how Dad used to take us there?" Margaret felt excited. David had not suggested doing something fun together in a long time. "That sounds wonderful," she said. "When? How about today? I'll pick you up around 11. We can see the leaves and maybe stop for lunch at that restaurant you like." Margaret could hardly believe it. David wanted to spend time with her. He wanted to take her to see the fall colors. Maybe things were getting better between them. "I'll be ready," she said. "Should I bring anything?" "No, Mom, just wear something warm. It might be cool in the mountains." After the phone call, Margaret felt happier than she had in months. She took a shower and put on her best dress. It was blue with small flowers on it. Robert had always said she looked pretty in blue. She brushed her hair carefully and put on lipstick. At 10:45, Margaret was sitting by the front window watching for David's car. She had her purse and a light sweater. She was ready for their special day together. David's car pulled into the driveway at 11 o'clock exactly. Margaret hurried to the door. David got out and walked up to the house. He was smiling, but something in his eyes looked strange. "Ready to go, Mom?" he asked. "Yes, I'm so excited," Margaret said. "It's been years since we've done something like this." David helped her into the passenger seat of his car. He put her seatbelt on for her like she was a child. "Comfortable?" he asked. "Very comfortable," Margaret said. "This is going to be such a nice day." David got into the driver's seat and started the car. As they drove through the neighborhood, Margaret pointed out houses and told stories about the people who lived in them. David nodded but didn't really listen. "Mrs. Peterson painted her house yellow," Margaret said. "I think it looks cheerful." "Mm-hmm," David said. They drove through the town center and past the restaurant where Margaret thought they would have lunch. Margaret looked back at it as they passed. "Aren't we stopping there?" she asked. "We'll stop on the way back," David said. "I want to see the leaves first while the light is good." Margaret was happy to wait. She was just glad to be spending time with her son. They drove for another 20 minutes. The houses became fewer and farther apart. Then they were driving through farmland. Then the road started going up into the hills. Margaret could see the trees changing colors on the mountainsides. "It's beautiful," she said. "The red maples are so bright this year." David didn't answer. His hands were tight on the steering wheel. His jaw was clenched like he was angry about something. "Are you okay, dear?" Margaret asked. "I'm fine," David said quickly. "Just concentrating on the road." They kept driving up into the mountains. The road became narrower and windier. Margaret had not been up here in years. She had forgotten how thick the forest was. The trees were so tall and close together that they blocked out most of the sky. "I don't remember this road," Margaret said. "Are you sure this is the right way?" "This is a new scenic route," David said. "Trust me." Margaret did trust him. David was her son. He would never do anything to hurt her. They drove for another 30 minutes. Margaret began to feel confused. They had passed several nice places to stop and look at the leaves, but David kept driving. The road was getting smaller and bumpier. There were no other cars around. "David, where are we going?" Margaret asked. "Almost there," David said, but his voice sounded tight and strange. Finally, David turned onto a dirt road. The car bounced and shook as they drove over rocks and holes. Margaret held onto the door handle. Trees pressed close on both sides of the road. She could not see any houses or other people. "This doesn't look like a scenic drive," Margaret said. She was starting to feel scared. "It's just a little farther," David said. After 10 more minutes, they came to a clearing in the forest. There was a small parking area and some old picnic tables. A wooden sign said Pine Ridge Campground. But the place looked empty and forgotten. Weeds grew up through cracks in the pavement. The picnic tables were covered with leaves and bird droppings. David stopped the car and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was complete. Margaret could not hear any cars or people, only wind in the trees and the sound of her own heartbeat. "This is it," David said. "Let's get out and look around." Margaret felt confused. This was not what she had expected. "There are no leaves to see here," she said. "It's just an old campground." "Come on, Mom," David said. He got out of the car and came around to her side. He opened her door and helped her out. Margaret stood on shaky legs. The air was cold and smelled like pine trees and old leaves. She could not see the road they had come from. The forest surrounded them completely. "David, I don't like this place," she said. "Can we go back to town now?" "In a minute," David said. "I just need to check something in the trunk." David walked to the back of the car and opened the trunk. Margaret stood by the picnic table and looked around. The forest was so quiet it felt like the world had stopped. She could not see any way out except the dirt road they had come from. She heard the trunk close. "David?" she called. "Are you ready to go?" There was no answer. Margaret turned around. David was not behind the car anymore. She looked around the clearing, but she could not see him anywhere. "David?" she called louder. "Where are you?" Then she heard a sound that made her heart stop. It was the sound of a car engine starting. She ran toward the parking area as fast as her old legs could carry her. David's car was backing up. She could see him through the windshield. His face looked straight ahead. He was not looking at her. "David!" Margaret screamed. "Don't leave me here!" She ran after the car, waving her arms. But David did not stop. He did not even slow down. The car bumped down the dirt road and disappeared into the trees. Margaret stood in the middle of the empty campground. The sound of the engine got fainter and fainter until she could not hear it at all. Then there was only silence. She could not believe what had just happened. Her own son had brought her to this empty place in the forest and left her here. It had to be a mistake. Maybe he thought she was already in the car. Maybe he would realize his mistake and come back. Margaret sat down on one of the old picnic tables and waited. Any minute now, David would come back up the road. He would be upset and sorry. He would say he thought she was in the car. They would laugh about the confusion and drive home together. But minutes passed and no car came. Margaret called David's name as loud as she could. Her voice echoed in the trees, but no one answered. The sun was getting lower in the sky. The air was getting colder. Margaret realized she was wearing only her dress and light sweater. She had her purse, but nothing else. No food, no water, no warm clothes. She walked to the edge of the clearing and looked down the dirt road. It disappeared into the dark forest. She had no idea how far it was back to the main road. She had no idea which direction to go if she reached the main road. Margaret felt panic rising in her chest. This could not be happening. David would not really leave her here. He was her son. She had taken care of him when he was sick. She had fed him and clothed him and loved him for 38 years. But as the shadows grew longer and the air grew colder, Margaret had to face the truth. David had brought her here on purpose. He had planned this. He had lied about the scenic drive and the restaurant. He had driven her deep into the forest where no one would find her. Her own son had left her here to die. Margaret sat on the picnic table as darkness fell around her. She was alone in the forest with no food, no water, and no way to get home. The temperature was dropping fast. She could hear animals moving in the woods around her. She thought about David driving home to his warm house. She thought about him telling Sarah that their problem was solved. She thought about him sleeping in his comfortable bed while she sat alone in the cold forest. Margaret Chen, who had never hurt anyone in her life, had been abandoned by the person she loved most in the world. She was 78 years old, and she was going to die alone in the wilderness because her son was tired of taking care of her. The first night was the worst night of Margaret's life. She had never been so cold or so scared. She sat on the picnic table bench and pulled her thin sweater tight around her shoulders. But the sweater was meant for a mild autumn day, not for sleeping outside in the mountains. The temperature dropped to near freezing. Margaret's breath came out in white puffs. Her fingers and toes went numb. She tried to stay awake because she was afraid that if she fell asleep, she might never wake. Strange sounds came from the dark forest around her. Owls hooting, branches breaking, something large moving through the bushes. Margaret had lived in the city all her life. She did not know what animals lived in these woods. She did not know which ones might hurt her. Every hour felt like 10 hours. Margaret watched the stars move across the sky and waited for dawn. She prayed over and over. She prayed that David would come back. She prayed that someone would find her. She prayed that she would live through the night. When the sun finally came up, Margaret was still alive, but barely. Her whole body was shaking from the cold. Her lips were blue. Her feet were so numb she could hardly stand up. But she was alive. And being alive meant she had to try to save herself. Margaret looked around the campground in the daylight. There were 6 old picnic tables and a fire pit full of cold ashes. There was an old building that might have been a bathroom once, but the door was locked and the windows were boarded up. Behind the campground, Margaret could see a small stream running through the trees. At least she would have water to drink. Margaret walked slowly to the stream. Her legs were stiff and sore from sitting all night. The water was clear and cold. She cupped her hands and drank. It tasted clean and good. She washed her face and hands. The cold water hurt, but it made her feel more awake. Margaret had never lived outdoors before, but somewhere deep in her memory, she remembered things her father had taught her when she was a little girl. He had grown up on a farm during the Great Depression. He knew how to find food in the wild. He knew how to stay warm and dry. Plants with red berries are usually poison, her father had said long ago. But rose hips are safe to eat. They have vitamin C. Margaret looked around and found some wild rose bushes near the stream. The roses were done blooming, but there were small red fruits on the stems. Rose hips. She picked a handful and ate them. They were sour and hard, but they gave her something to put in her empty stomach. Her father had also taught her about edible plants. Dandelion leaves are good to eat, he had said. Acorns can be food if you prepare them right. Pine needles can be made into tea. Margaret spent the morning looking for these things. She found dandelion plants and ate the bitter leaves. She found acorns under the oak trees, but she did not know how to prepare them. She collected pine needles to make tea, but she had no way to make fire. The most important thing was to stay warm. Margaret gathered dead leaves and pine needles to make a bed under one of the picnic tables. The table would give her some protection from wind and rain. The leaves would help keep her warm. She also tried to make herself visible to anyone who might come looking. She hung her bright blue sweater on a tree branch, where it could be seen from the road. She arranged rocks in the shape of letters that spelled help. She hoped that maybe a helicopter would fly over and see her signals, but no helicopters came. No cars came up the dirt road. Margaret was completely alone. On the second day, Margaret tried to walk out of the forest. She followed the dirt road as far as she could, but after walking for 2 hours, she was exhausted and the road seemed to go on forever. She was afraid she would get lost and never find her way back to the stream and her leaf bed. She turned around and walked back to the campground. Her feet were covered with blisters from her dress shoes. The shoes were not made for walking on rough ground. Every step was painful. That night was a little easier because Margaret was more prepared. She had more leaves in her bed. She had found some wild berries to eat. She had drunk plenty of water from the stream, but she was still cold and scared and very lonely. On the third day, Margaret heard a sound that made her heart jump with hope. It was the sound of a car engine far away. She ran toward the sound as fast as she could, calling for help, but the sound faded away before she could reach the road. Maybe it was just a car passing on the main highway miles away. Margaret realized that even if people were looking for her, they might not think to look in this remote place. David could have told everyone that she had gone to visit relatives. He could have said she was in a nursing home. No one would know to look for her in the forest. This thought made Margaret feel more alone than ever. Not only was she lost and cold and hungry, but no one even knew she was missing. On the fourth day, Margaret felt weaker. She had not eaten real food in 4 days. The rose hips and dandelion leaves were not enough to keep her alive. Her body was using up all its stored energy. She felt dizzy when she stood up. Her thoughts were becoming fuzzy. Margaret began to think about death. She thought about Robert waiting for her somewhere beyond this world. She thought about her parents and her friends who had already died. Maybe it would not be so bad to join them. But something inside Margaret refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was hope. Maybe it was anger at David for what he had done to her. She was not ready to die. Not like this. Not abandoned in the forest like a piece of trash. Margaret forced herself to keep looking for food. She found a patch of wild onions near the stream. They were small and strong-tasting, but they were real vegetables. She ate them slowly and tried to make them last. She also found some mushrooms growing on a dead log. But she remembered her father's warning about mushrooms. "Never eat mushrooms you find in the wild," he had said. "Most of them won't kill you, but some will. It's not worth the risk." So Margaret left the mushrooms alone, even though she was very hungry. On the 5th day, Margaret could barely stand up. Her body was eating its own muscles for energy. Her mind wandered in and out of dreams. Sometimes she forgot where she was. Sometimes she called for Robert or for her mother. But in her clear moments, Margaret was still fighting to survive. She moved her leaf bed to a spot that got more morning sun. She made a cup out of a large leaf to carry water from the stream. She practiced calling for help to keep her voice strong. Late on the 5th day, Margaret heard another car engine. This time it sounded closer. This time it seemed to be coming up the dirt road toward the campground. Margaret used all her remaining strength to get up and walk toward the road. She was ready to wave her arms and shout for help. She was ready to be saved. But as the sound got closer, Margaret realized it was not a rescue car. It was just one car moving slowly and quietly. Someone was coming to the campground for some reason. Maybe they were not looking for her at all. Margaret hid behind a tree near the road. She wanted to see who it was before she showed herself. If it was someone who meant her harm, she did not want them to know she was there. The car came into view through the trees. It was old and dirty. 2 men got out. They were carrying beer cans and talking loudly. They walked toward the campground, like they owned the place. Margaret could tell these were not good men. Something about the way they moved and talked scared her. She stayed hidden behind the tree and hoped they would leave soon. The men stayed for 2 hours. They drank beer and threw the cans on the ground. They were loud and used bad language. Margaret was afraid they would find her signals for help. She was afraid they would find her. Finally, the men got back in their car and drove away. Margaret waited until she could not hear the engine anymore before she came out of hiding. Now Margaret felt more scared than ever. Bad people knew about this place. They might come back. And if they found her here alone, she did not know what they might do to her. Margaret realized that being rescued might be dangerous too. Not everyone who found her would want to help her. Some people might want to hurt her. As night fell on her 5th day in the forest, Margaret felt hopeless for the way. First time. She was weak from hunger and cold. Her body was shutting down. Bad people knew where she was. Her own son had left her here to die. Margaret curled up in her bed of leaves and closed her eyes. She was not sure she would live through another night. She was not sure she wanted to, but somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees someone was looking for her. Someone who loved her was driving through the night, calling her name, refusing to give up hope. Margaret did not know this yet. She did not know that help was coming. She only knew that she had survived 5 days alone in the wilderness, and that was something to be proud of, even if she died tonight. Margaret woke up on her 6th morning in the forest and could not feel her feet. During the night, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Ice had formed on the stream and on the leaves around her makeshift bed. She tried to sit up, but her body would not obey her. Every muscle ached. Her head felt light and strange. When she finally managed to stand, she fell down immediately. Her legs would not hold her weight. Margaret crawled to the stream on her hands and knees. The ice was thin and she could break it with her hand. She drank the cold water, but it hurt her throat. Her stomach was so empty that the water made her feel sick. She looked at her reflection in the water and was shocked. The face looking back at her was like a stranger's. Her cheeks were hollow. Her eyes were sunken deep in her head. Her hair was dirty and tangled with leaves and twigs. She looked like a wild animal, not like a person. Margaret had always been a clean, proper woman. She had taken pride in her appearance. Now she looked like something from a scary movie. But she was still alive, and that was what mattered. Food was becoming desperate. She had eaten all the rose hips she could find. The dandelion leaves were gone. The wild onions were finished. Margaret looked at the mushrooms growing on the dead logs and thought again about eating them. Maybe dying from poison mushrooms would be faster than dying from hunger. But she remembered her father's voice. "Stay strong, Margaret. Don't give up. Help will come." Her father had been dead for 30 years, but she could hear his voice as clear as if he was standing next to her. It gave her the strength to leave the mushrooms alone. Instead, Margaret tried something new. She found acorns under the oak trees and tried to prepare them the way her father had taught her long ago. She smashed them with rocks to remove the shells. Then she soaked them in the stream to wash away the bitter taste. The process took hours and used up energy she did not have. But when she was done, she had a small amount of food that would not poison her. The acorns were still bitter and hard to chew, but they were better than nothing. Margaret also tried eating tree bark. She had heard somewhere that some kinds of bark could be food. She scraped the inner bark from a birch tree with a sharp rock. It was tough and tasteless, but she forced herself to eat it. Her father had also taught her to look for grubs and insects under rotting logs. The idea made Margaret feel sick, but she was desperate. She turned over several logs and found fat white grubs crawling in the dirt. Margaret stared at the grubs for a long time. She had never eaten anything like this in her life. But she was starving. She picked up one grub and put it in her mouth before she could change her mind. It was soft and squishy and tasted like dirt, but it was protein. It was food. She ate 3 more grubs and then had to stop because she was going to vomit. But she had gotten some nutrition into her body. She had done what she needed to do to survive. The hardest part was the loneliness. Margaret had never been alone for so long in her life. Even after Robert died, she had neighbors and friends. She had David to call. She had the grocery store clerk to talk to. Now she had no human contact at all. Margaret began talking to herself just to hear a human voice. She told stories about her childhood. She described what she was doing as she did it. "Now I'm going to drink some water," she would say out loud. "Now I'm going to look for food." She also talked to Robert as if he was there with her. "Robert, I'm so scared," she would say. "Robert, I don't think I can do this much longer." Sometimes she imagined that Robert answered her. "You're stronger than you think, Margaret," his voice would say. "You can survive this. I'm proud of you." These conversations with Robert helped Margaret feel less alone. They helped her remember who she was before this nightmare started. On her 7th day, Margaret tried again to walk out of the forest. She felt a little stronger because of the acorns and grubs she had eaten. She walked farther down the dirt road than she had before. But after 3 hours of walking, she was exhausted and the road still had no end. Worse, she was not sure she could find her way back to the campground. Everything looked the same in the dense forest. Margaret sat down on a rock to rest and think. If she got lost in the woods, she would have no water and no shelter. She would probably die within a day. It was safer to go back to the campground where she had water and knew the area. The walk back to the campground took 4 hours. Margaret's feet were bleeding inside her dress shoes. The blisters had opened and become infected. Every step was agony. When she finally reached the campground, Margaret collapsed on her bed of leaves. She was weaker now than when she had started the day. The attempt to escape had cost her more energy than she had gained from the food. That night, Margaret seriously considered giving up. She was getting weaker every day. Her body was eating itself. The infections in her feet were getting worse. Even if someone came looking for her now, she might be too weak to call for help. Margaret looked up at the stars through the tree branches. The stars were beautiful and peaceful. It would not be so bad to die under these stars. She could just close her eyes and let go. The cold and hunger would stop hurting. She would be with Robert again. But when morning came, Margaret was still alive. Some stubborn part of her refused to die. Maybe it was because she was angry at David. Maybe it was because she wanted to see Sarah again. Maybe it was just because dying was harder than living. On her 8th day, Margaret heard something that made her heart race. It was the sound of voices in the distance, human voices calling something she could not understand. Margaret used all her strength to stand up. She called back as loud as she could. "Help, I'm here, help me!" The voices stopped. Margaret called again. "Please, I need help." She heard the voices again, but they were moving away from her, getting fainter. Soon she could not hear them at all. Margaret fell to her knees and cried. Someone had been close enough to hear her, but they had not found her. Maybe they were hikers who thought they heard an echo. Maybe they were the bad men coming back to drink beer. The disappointment was almost too much to bear. Margaret had thought she was going to be rescued. For a few minutes she had allowed herself to hope. Now the hope was gone and the despair was worse than ever. On her 9th day, Margaret could barely move. She crawled to the stream to drink water, but she could not look for food. She just lay on her bed of leaves and waited to die. Her mind began to wander in strange ways. Sometimes she thought she was back in her kitchen making breakfast for Robert. Sometimes she thought she was a little girl playing in her mother's garden. Sometimes she thought David was there with her, apologizing for what he had done. But reality always came back. She was alone in the forest. She was dying slowly. Her own son had brought her here and left her to die. Margaret tried to understand why David had done this to her. She knew she had been forgetful lately. She knew she had been more trouble for him. But she had never asked him to abandon her. She had never wanted to be a burden. She thought about all the years she had taken care of David, all the nights she had stayed up when he was sick, all the times she had helped him with homework or driven him to friends' houses, all the money she and Robert had spent on his clothes and food and education. Margaret had never thought of David as a burden when he was young. She had never considered leaving him somewhere when taking care of him got hard. That was what mothers did. They took care of their children no matter what. But apparently children did not feel the same way about their aging parents. Margaret began to think about Sarah. Sarah had always been kind to her. Sarah had never looked at her like she was a problem to be solved. If Sarah knew where Margaret was, she would come to find her. But Sarah did not know. David had probably told her some lie. Maybe he said Margaret had gone to stay with relatives. Maybe he said she was in a nursing home. Sarah would have no reason to doubt him. On her 10th day, Margaret heard the sound of rain starting to fall. She had been lucky with the weather so far. Cold nights, but no rain or snow. Now the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. The rain started slowly but got heavier through the day. Margaret had no real shelter. The picnic table protected her a little, but water dripped through the cracks between the boards. Soon her bed of leaves was soaked and cold. Margaret's thin clothes were wet through within an hour. She shivered uncontrollably. She knew that being wet and cold was much more dangerous than being just cold. People died of hypothermia in weather like this. Margaret tried to find better shelter, but there was none. The old bathroom building was locked. There were no caves or overhangs. She could only huddle under the picnic table and wait for the rain to stop. The rain continued all night. Margaret did not sleep at all. She was too cold and wet and miserable. She could feel her body temperature dropping. Her thoughts became confused and slow. By morning, Margaret was very close to death. Her lips were blue. Her skin was gray. She could barely speak or move. The rain had stopped, but the damage was done. Margaret lay on the wet ground and prepared to die. She was ready now. She had fought as hard as she could. She had survived for 10 days in the wilderness with no food, no shelter, and no help. That was more than most people could do. She closed her eyes and thought about the people she had loved. Her parents, Robert, David, even though he had betrayed her. Her grandchildren, Emma and Lucy. Sarah Chen noticed something was different about her husband the day after he took his mother for a drive. David seemed lighter somehow, like a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He whistled while making coffee. He smiled at their daughters Emma and Lucy during breakfast. He had not been this relaxed in months. "You seem happy today," Sarah said, watching David butter his toast. "I feel good," David said. "I slept really well last night." "How was your drive with your mother?" "Yesterday," Sarah asked. "Did she enjoy seeing the fall colors?" David paused for just a moment. "Oh yes, she loved it. We had a nice time." "Where did you go exactly?" Sarah asked. "Up in the mountains. You know, the scenic route through the state forest." Sarah nodded, but something felt wrong. David was not looking at her when he answered. He was being vague about details. Usually when David did something with his mother, he had complaints about it afterward. This time he seemed almost cheerful. "Is your mother feeling better these days?" Sarah asked. "Actually, yes," David said quickly. "Much better. She's doing fine now." That afternoon, Sarah decided to call Margaret to see how she was doing. She dialed the number but got no answer. Margaret's answering machine did not pick up either. That was strange. Margaret was almost always home during the day. Sarah tried calling again that evening. Still no answer. She asked David about it when he came home from work. "I tried calling your mother today, but she didn't answer," Sarah said. David looked surprised. "Oh, that's because she's not there," he said. "What do you mean she's not there?" "She decided to go stay with her cousin in Florida for a while," David said. "You know, get away from the cold weather. She left this morning." Sarah was confused. "She didn't mention anything about Florida yesterday, and I didn't know she had a cousin there." "It was a last-minute decision," David said. "Her cousin called and invited her. Mom thought it would be good for her health." Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but David had already turned on the television. He was watching the news and acting like the conversation was over. The next day, Sarah tried calling Margaret again. The phone rang and rang with no answer. Sarah decided to drive over to Margaret's house to see if she was really gone. The house looked empty. Margaret's car was still in the driveway, which was strange if she had gone to Florida. Sarah walked around the house and looked in the windows. The curtains were closed and she could not see inside very well. Sarah knocked on the door even though she knew no one would answer. She tried the door handle, but it was locked. She used the spare key that Margaret kept under a flower pot. Inside, the house felt cold and still. It had the feeling of a place where no one had been for several days. Sarah called out, "Margaret," but heard only her own echo. Sarah looked around for signs that Margaret had packed for a trip. Her suitcase was still in the bedroom closet. Her toiletries were still in the bathroom. Her medications were still on the kitchen counter. If Margaret had gone to Florida, she had taken nothing with her. Sarah felt a cold fear growing in her stomach. Something was very wrong here. She searched the house more carefully. Margaret's purse was gone. So were her winter coat and a few items of clothing. But most of her things were still there. It looked like someone had taken just enough to make it look like she had gone somewhere. Sarah found Margaret's address book and looked for the cousin in Florida. There was no cousin listed anywhere. There were no relatives in Florida at all. David had lied to her. Sarah drove home with her mind racing. Why would David lie about where his mother was? Where was Margaret, really? And why did David seem so happy about whatever had happened? When David came home that evening, Sarah confronted him. "I went to your mother's house today," she said. "She's not in Florida." David's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "Her car is still there. Her suitcase is still there. Her medications are still there. She didn't pack for any trip." David was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him thinking, trying to come up with another lie. "Maybe she didn't take much with her," he said finally. "Maybe her cousin had things she could use." "David, there is no cousin in Florida," Sarah said. "I looked in her address book. Where is your mother, really?" David's face was red now. He looked angry and trapped. "Why are you interrogating me?" he said. "Why can't you just trust me?" "Because you're lying to me," Sarah said. "Your mother is missing, and you're acting like everything is fine." David stood up and walked to the window. He was quiet for several minutes. Sarah waited, her heart pounding. "She's in a nursing home," David said finally, not turning around. "What nursing home?" "Sunset Manor, about an hour from here." Sarah felt a little relieved. At least Margaret was somewhere safe. But she was still confused about why David had lied. "Why? Didn't you just tell me that?" Sarah asked. "Why the story about Florida?" David turned around. His face looked tired and sad. "Because I knew you would be upset about it. I knew you would think I was being cruel. How long is she going to be there?" David looked at the floor. "Permanently. She can't live alone anymore, Sarah. You saw how she was. The spoiled food, the unpaid bills, the confusion. Someone needs to watch her all the time." Sarah felt sad for Margaret, but she understood David's reasoning. Maybe a nursing home was the best solution. "Can we visit her this weekend?" Sarah asked. "She needs time to adjust," David said. "The doctors said no visitors for the first few weeks." Over the next few days, Sarah tried to feel good about Margaret being in professional care. But something still bothered her. David seemed too happy about it. And why had he made up the story? About Florida first? Sarah decided to call Sunset Manor to check on Margaret. She looked up the number and called during her lunch break at work. "Hi, I'm calling to check on Margaret Chen," Sarah said. "She was admitted a few days ago." "Let me check our records," the woman said. Sarah waited on hold for several minutes. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any patient by that name," the woman said when she came back. Sarah's heart started beating fast. "Are you sure? Margaret Chen? She's 78 years old." "I've checked all our recent admissions. No Margaret Chen." Sarah thanked the woman and hung up. David had lied again. That evening, Sarah waited until David went to take a shower. Then she searched through his things looking for any clue about where Margaret really was. In David's desk, Sarah found a folder of papers about nursing homes. There were brochures and price lists for several different facilities, but there were no admission papers for Margaret, no receipts for payments, no evidence that Margaret was actually in any nursing home. Sarah also found something that made her blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy on Margaret. David was the beneficiary. The policy was worth $50,000. Sarah had never known about this insurance policy. She wondered when David had gotten it and why he had never mentioned it. The next day, Sarah called 3 more nursing homes in the area. None of them had Margaret Chen as a patient. Sarah was starting to panic. Where was Margaret? What had David done with her? Sarah thought about calling the police, but what would she tell them? That her husband had lied about where his mother was? That was not really a crime. The police would probably tell her it was a family matter. Sarah decided to follow David after work to see where he went. Maybe he was visiting Margaret somewhere and lying about the location. But David came straight home from work every day. He did not stop anywhere. He did not act like someone who was visiting his mother in a nursing home. On Saturday, Sarah told David she wanted to go shopping. Instead, she drove to all the nursing homes in a 50-mile radius. She showed Margaret's picture to the staff at each one. No one had seen her. Sarah also drove to the hospital to see if Margaret had been admitted there. She was not there either. By Sunday, Sarah was desperate. It had been a week since anyone had seen Margaret. Sarah was starting to think something terrible had happened to her. That night, Sarah confronted David again. "I called Sunset Manor," she said. "Margaret is not there." David's face went white. "You called them?" "Yes, and I called every other nursing home in the area. Margaret is not in any of them." David sat down heavily on the couch. He put his head in his hands. "David, where is your mother?" Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking. David was quiet for a long time. Sarah could see that he was struggling with something. Finally, he looked up at her. "I can't tell you," he said. "What do you mean you can't tell me?" "I mean I can't tell you because you'll hate me." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "David, what did you do?" David started crying. Sarah had never seen her husband cry before. He sobbed like a child, his whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" Sarah demanded. "Where is Margaret?" David looked up at his wife with tears streaming down his face. "I left her in the forest," he said. Sarah could not believe what she had heard. "You what?" "I drove her up to the state forest and I left her there," David said. "I couldn't take care of her anymore. I couldn't afford to put her in a nursing home. I didn't know what else to do." Sarah stared at her husband in horror. "You left a 78-year-old woman alone in the forest?" "She was becoming a burden," David said desperately. "You saw how she was living. She was going to die anyway, probably in some accident at home. At least this way it would be quick." Sarah felt like she was going to vomit. "David, that's murder." Sarah Chen noticed something was different about her husband the day after he took his mother for a drive. David seemed lighter somehow, like a heavy weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He whistled while making coffee. He smiled at their daughters Emma and Lucy during breakfast. He had not been this relaxed in months. "You seem happy today," Sarah said, watching David butter his toast. "I feel good," David said. "I slept really well last night." "How was your drive with your mother yesterday?" Sarah asked. "Did she enjoy seeing the fall colors?" David paused for just a moment. "Oh yes, she loved it. We had a nice time." "Where did you go exactly?" Sarah asked. "Up in the mountains. You know, the scenic route through the state forest." Sarah nodded, but something felt wrong. David was not looking at her when he answered. He was being vague about details. Usually when David did something with his mother, he had complaints about it afterward. This time he seemed almost cheerful. "Is your mother feeling better these days?" Sarah asked. "Actually, yes," David said quickly. "Much better. She's doing fine now." That afternoon, Sarah decided to call Margaret to see how she was doing. She dialed the number but got no answer. Margaret's answering machine did not pick up either. That was strange. Margaret was almost always home during the day. Sarah tried calling again that evening. Still no answer. She asked David about it when he came home from work. "I tried calling your mother today, but she didn't answer," Sarah said. David looked surprised. "Oh, that's because she's not there," he said. "What do you mean she's not there?" "She decided to go stay with her cousin in Florida for a while," David said. "You know, get away from the cold weather. She left this morning." Sarah was confused. "She didn't mention anything about Florida yesterday. And I didn't know she had a cousin there." "It was a last-minute decision," David said. "Her cousin called and invited her. Mom thought it would be good for her health." Sarah wanted to ask more questions, but David had already turned on the television. He was watching the news and acting like the conversation was over. The next day, Sarah tried calling Margaret again. The phone rang and rang with no answer. Sarah decided to drive over to Margaret's house to see if she was really gone. The house looked empty. Margaret's car was still in the driveway, which was strange if she had gone to Florida. Sarah walked around the house and looked in the windows. The curtains were closed and she could not see inside very well. Sarah knocked on the door even though she knew no one would answer. She tried the door handle, but it was locked. She used the spare key that Margaret kept under a flower pot. Inside, the house felt cold and still. It had the feeling of a place where no one had been for several days. Sarah called out, "Margaret," but heard only her own echo. Sarah looked around for signs that Margaret had packed for a trip. Her suitcase was still in the bedroom closet. Her toiletries were still in the bathroom. Her medications were still on the kitchen counter. If Margaret had gone to Florida, she had taken nothing with her. Sarah felt a cold fear growing in her stomach. Something was very wrong here. She searched the house more carefully. Margaret's purse was gone. So were her winter coat and a few items of clothing. But most of her things were still there. It looked like someone had taken just enough to make it look like she had gone somewhere. Sarah found Margaret's address book and looked for the cousin in Florida. There was no cousin listed anywhere. There were no relatives in Florida at all. David had lied to her. Sarah drove home with her mind racing. Why would David lie about where his mother was? Where was Margaret really? And why did David seem so happy about whatever had happened? When David came home that evening, Sarah confronted him. "I went to your mother's house today," she said. "She's not in Florida." David's face went pale. "What do you mean?" "Her car is still there. Her suitcase is still there. Her medications are still there. She didn't pack for any trip." David was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see him thinking, trying to come up with another lie. "Maybe she didn't take much with her," he said finally. "Maybe her cousin had things she could use." "David, there is no cousin in Florida," Sarah said. "I looked in her address book. Where is your mother really?" David's face was red now. He looked angry and trapped. "Why are you interrogating me?" he said. "Why can't you just trust me?" "Because you're lying to me," Sarah said. "Your mother is missing and you're acting like everything is fine." David stood up and walked to the window. He was quiet for several minutes. Sarah waited, her heart pounding. "She's in a nursing home," David said finally, not turning around. "What nursing home?" "Sunset Manor, about an hour from here." Sarah felt a little relieved. At least Margaret was somewhere safe, but she was still confused about why David had lied. "Why didn't you just tell me that?" Sarah asked. "Why the story about Florida?" David turned around. His face looked tired and sad. "Because I knew you would be upset about it. I knew you would think I was being cruel. How long is she going to be there?" David looked at the floor. "Permanently. She can't live alone anymore, Sarah. You saw how she was. The spoiled food, the unpaid bills, the confusion. Someone needs to watch her all the time." Sarah felt sad for Margaret, but she understood David's reasoning. Maybe a nursing home was the best solution. "Can we visit her this weekend?" Sarah asked. "She needs time to adjust," David said. "The doctor said no visitors for the first few weeks." Over the next few days, Sarah tried to feel good about Margaret being in professional care, but something still bothered her. David seemed too happy about it. And why had he made up the story about Florida first? Sarah decided to call Sunset Manor to check on Margaret. She looked up the number and called during her lunch break at work. "Hi, I'm calling to check on Margaret Chen," Sarah said. "She was admitted a few days ago." "Let me check our records," the woman said. Sarah waited on hold for several minutes. "I'm sorry, but we don't have any patient by that name," the woman said when she came back. Sarah's heart started beating fast. "Are you sure? Margaret Chen? She's 78 years old. I've checked all our recent admissions. No Margaret Chen." Sarah thanked the woman and hung up. David had lied again. That evening, Sarah waited until David went to take a shower. Then she searched through his things looking for any clue about where Margaret really was. In David's desk, Sarah found a folder of papers about nursing homes. There were brochures and price lists for several different facilities, but there were no admission papers for Margaret. No receipts for payments, no evidence that Margaret was actually in any nursing home. Sarah also found something that made her blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy on Margaret. David was the beneficiary. The policy was worth $50,000. Sarah had never known about this insurance policy. She wondered when David had gotten it and why he had never mentioned it. The next day, Sarah called 3 more nursing homes in the area. None of them had Margaret Chen as a patient. Sarah was starting to panic. Where was Margaret? What had David done with her? Sarah thought about calling the police, but what would she tell them? That her husband had lied about where his mother was. That was not really a crime. The police would probably tell her it was a family matter. Sarah decided to follow David after work to see where he went. Maybe he was visiting Margaret somewhere and lying about the location. But David came straight home from work every day. He did not stop anywhere. He did not act like someone who was visiting his mother in a nursing home. On Saturday, Sarah told David she wanted to go shopping. Instead, she drove to all the nursing homes in a 50-mile radius. She showed Margaret's picture to the staff at each one. No one had seen her. Sarah also drove to the hospital to see if Margaret had been admitted there. She was not there either. By Sunday, Sarah was desperate. It had been a week since anyone had seen Margaret. Sarah was starting to think something terrible had happened to her. That night, Sarah confronted David again. "I called Sunset Manor," she said. "Margaret is not there." David's face went white. "You called them?" "Yes. And I called every other nursing home in the area. Margaret is not in any of them." David sat down heavily on the couch. He put his head in his hands. "David, where is your mother?" Sarah asked. Her voice was shaking. David was quiet for a long time. Sarah could see that he was struggling with something. Finally, he looked up at her. "I can't tell you," he said. "What do you mean you can't tell me?" "I mean I can't tell you because you'll hate me." Sarah felt ice in her veins. "David, what did you do?" David started crying. Sarah had never seen her husband cry before. He sobbed like a child, his whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he said over and over. "I'm so sorry." "Sorry for what?" Sarah demanded. "Where is Margaret?" David looked up at his wife with tears streaming down his face. "I left her in the forest," he said. Sarah could not believe what she had heard. "You what?" "I drove her up to the state forest and I left her there," David said. "I couldn't take care of her anymore. I couldn't afford to put her in a nursing home. I didn't know what else to do." Sarah stared at her husband in horror. "You left a 78-year-old woman alone in the forest?" "She was becoming a burden," David said desperately. "You saw how she was living. She was going to die anyway, probably in some accident at home. At least this way it would be quick." Sarah felt like she was going to vomit. "David, that's murder." Margaret woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed. For a moment, she thought she was still in the forest. The white ceiling looked like clouds. The beeping machines sounded like birds chirping. But then she felt the warm blankets and saw the IV tube in her arm, and she knew she was safe. Sarah was sitting in a chair next to the bed. When she saw Margaret's eyes open, she smiled and took her hand. "Welcome back," Sarah said softly. Margaret tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Sarah gave her ice chips to suck on until she could talk. "How long have I been here?" Margaret asked. 3 days, Sarah said. You were very sick when I found you. The doctors weren't sure you would make it. Margaret remembered pieces of that night. The rain, Sarah calling her name, being carried through the forest, the ambulance ride. But most of it was fuzzy like a dream. "Where is David?" Margaret asked. Sarah's face became serious. "He's in jail," she said. "I called the police and told them what he did to you. He's been charged with attempted murder and elder abuse." Margaret felt sad and relieved at the same time. She was sad that her own son was in jail, but she was relieved that he could not hurt her anymore. "Will I have to go to court?" Margaret asked. "Probably," Sarah said, "but don't worry about that now. Just focus on getting better." Over the next week, Margaret slowly recovered her strength. The doctors were amazed by how well she was healing. They said most people her age would not have survived what she went through. "You must have a very strong will to live," Dr. Martinez told her. Margaret thought about this. She had wanted to give up many times in the forest, but something inside her had refused to die. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was hope that someone would find her. Maybe it was anger at David for what he had done. Sarah visited Margaret every day. She brought flowers and books and pictures from home. She also brought news about what was happening with David. "He hired a lawyer," Sarah told Margaret one afternoon. "He's trying to say that he was having a mental breakdown, that he wasn't thinking clearly." Margaret shook her head. "He planned it," she said. "He lied to me about where we were going. He made up the story about seeing the fall colors. That's not a mental breakdown, that's planning." Sarah nodded. "That's what the prosecutor thinks too." Sarah also told Margaret about the changes in her own life. "I filed for divorce," she said. "I can't stay married to someone who would do what David did." Margaret felt guilty about this. "I'm sorry I ruined your marriage," she said. "You didn't ruin anything," Sarah said firmly. "David ruined it when he decided to abandon you. I could never trust him again after this." "What about Emma and Lucy?" Margaret asked. Emma and Lucy were David's daughters, Margaret's granddaughters. "They're staying with me," Sarah said. "They know what their father did. They're angry and confused, but they'll be okay. Kids are stronger than we think." After 2 weeks in the hospital, Margaret was well enough to go home. But she had no home to go to. David owned her house and she could not go back there. "You're coming to live with me," Sarah said. "I've already set up a room for you." Margaret was surprised. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." Sarah took Margaret's hands and looked into her eyes. "You are not a burden," she said. "You are family, and family takes care of each other." Moving in with Sarah was different from living alone, but it was good different. Sarah's house was warm and full of life. Emma and Lucy were teenagers now, but they were happy to have their grandmother living with them. Margaret helped with cooking and cleaning, but only as much as she wanted to. Sarah never made her feel like she had to earn her place in the house. "This is your home now," Sarah said. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." Margaret also helped take care of Emma and Lucy. She drove them to school and activities. She helped them with homework. She listened to their problems and gave them advice. The girls had been angry with their father at first. They could not understand how he could do such a terrible thing to their grandmother. But Margaret helped them work through their feelings. "Your father made a very bad choice," Margaret told them. "But that doesn't mean he never loved you. People can do wrong things and still have love in their hearts." "How can you not hate him?" Lucy asked. "He tried to kill you." Margaret thought about this for a long time before answering. "Hating him would hurt me more than it would hurt him," she said. "I choose to focus on the people who love me, like you and Emma and your mother." David's trial took place 6 months later. Margaret had to testify about what happened. It was hard to face David in the courtroom. He looked older and sadder than she remembered. But he also looked angry, like he still thought he was the victim. Margaret told the jury everything that had happened. She described the lie about the scenic drive. She told them about being abandoned in the forest. She talked about the 10 days she spent trying to survive. "Why do you think your son did this to you?" the prosecutor asked. Margaret looked at David before she answered. Because he saw me as a problem instead of a person, she said. Because he forgot that I was his mother who loved him. David's lawyer tried to make it sound like David had been overwhelmed by stress. He talked about the financial pressure and the difficulty of caring for an aging parent. But the prosecutor had evidence that David had been planning this for weeks. He had researched life insurance policies. He had looked up remote camping areas. He had even searched the internet for how long can elderly persons survive without food. The jury found David guilty of attempted murder and elder abuse. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Margaret felt sad when she heard the sentence. She did not want David to go to prison for so long, but she also knew that what he had done was very serious. Other elderly people needed to be protected from children who might make the same choice. After the trial, Margaret's story became famous. Newspapers wrote articles about the elderly woman who survived 10 days alone in the forest. Television shows interviewed her about her experience. Margaret did not like all the attention at first, but she realized that her story could help other people. She started speaking at senior centers and community groups about elder abuse. Don't be afraid to ask for help, she told audiences. And don't let anyone make you feel like you're a burden. Every person has value no matter how old they are. Margaret also worked with lawmakers to create stronger laws about elder abuse. She wanted to make sure that what happened to her would be harder for other people to do. 2 years after the rescue, Margaret was living a full and happy life. She had her own room in Sarah's house with pictures of Robert and her family. She had a small garden in the backyard where she grew tomatoes and roses. She had friends at the senior center where she volunteered. Most importantly, she had a family that loved her. Sarah treated her like a mother, not like a burden. Emma and Lucy called her grandma and came to her for advice about school and boys and life. I'm happier now than I was before, Margaret told Sarah one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. How can that be? Sarah asked. After everything you went through? Margaret thought about this. Because now I know who really loves me, she said. Because I know I'm stronger than I thought I was. And because I have a purpose again. Margaret's purpose was helping other elderly people who were being mistreated by their families. She worked with social workers and police to identify signs of elder abuse. She visited elderly people who had no family to check on them. I survived. For a reason, Margaret told the people she helped. Maybe the reason was to help you. Emma and Lucy grew up and went to college, but they stayed close to their grandmother. They brought their friends home to meet her. They called her every week when they were away at school. They were proud to tell people about how brave and strong she was. My grandmother survived 10 days alone in the forest, Emma would tell people. She's the toughest person I know. Sarah never remarried. She said she was too busy raising her daughters and taking care of Margaret. But Margaret suspected that Sarah was afraid to trust another man after what David had done. Not all men are like David, Margaret told her. I know, Sarah said, but I'm happy with our family the way it is. Margaret understood. Sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born with. 5 years after the rescue, Margaret received a letter from David in prison. He said he was sorry for what he had done. He said he had been seeing a counselor and understood now how wrong he had been. Margaret read the letter several times. Part of her wanted to forgive David and try to rebuild their relationship, but a bigger part of her knew that some things could not be fixed. Margaret wrote back a short letter. She said she was glad David was getting help. She said she hoped he would become a better person, but she also said she did not want any more contact with him. I forgive you, Margaret wrote. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to let you back into my life. I'm safe and happy now and I want to stay that way. Margaret showed the letter to Sarah before she sent it. Are you sure? Sarah asked. He is your son. He stopped being my son when he left me in that forest, Margaret said. Real sons don't abandon their mothers. Margaret lived with Sarah's family for 8 more years. She saw Emma graduate from college and get married. She saw Lucy become a teacher. She held her great-grandchildren and told them stories about surviving in the wilderness.